Richie, remind us how long you spent following this story.
Well, I started covering it back in late 2006, and I was living with my uncle, who was a farmer in the area, because I would have spent all my summers up there, and then I moved back there from Tipperary. And in late 2006, a force of 200 police were drafted into the area to break the local blockade, as you saw. And I was just kind of living there. I had no huge interest in it. I'm concentrating on my career and being a cameraman and all that. And then I started filming this, and what I noticed was, and I was sending footage back to news and getting paid for it too, I noticed that the media weren't portraying what I was seeing on the ground, and the story of normal, decent people just looking to protect their health, their safety, their environment. What I was seeing through a lot of the media was these people being portrayed as thugs and bullies. Even there's accusations of IRA terrorism amongst these people, which was, someone living locally was complete bananas, So I decided to film more and more, and the more I filmed, it was like a can of worms, just the more that came out. And I thought I might be there for 6 months then, and we'd make a half-hour documentary, but I was there for the next 3.5 years. I just couldn't, I just couldn't walk away. Like, they were just such incredible people, and so kind of welcoming and open, and I really kind of fell in love with the story and the people. And, it wasn't until 3 years later when the Solitaire came in, and I'm in the back of Pat's boat, and we're heading straight towards this monster of a thing, thinking, what have I got myself into, I didn't think I'd ever come back. But he's just such an incredible character. I always felt very safe with him, In fact, I was so seasick that I didn't really even kind of think of the danger. So,
Rachel, as a producer, I wanted to ask you if you can kind of bring us up to date with what's happening with this story. We see some credits some text at the end, and where are we now?
Sure. Well, we finished this back in July, last July. So there have been a lot of developments since then. So the latest plan that Shell had was to bridge the 9 kilometres between the pipe in the sea and the refinery and land. The 9 kilometres overland, as in the text, was deemed unacceptable. So they then updated their plans to bring the pipe 5 kilometres underground, so underneath the bay that you see at the beginning where Willie is digging up the shells, 5 kilometres underground, and then it'll pop up and travel the remaining 4 kilometres inland to the refinery. Now, on the day of the general election, just a couple of weeks back, the interim minister signed a lot of the key consents for Shell for their foreshore licence as well, has just been granted in the last couple of days. And on Tashka, the Heritage National Trust basically have started to take a judicial review because basically they are saying that it's been a political decision, not a legal one, to allow this to continue. So we had a fundraising screening last Wednesday in Dublin for that, but they kind of really need people's support now.
We will take some questions from the audience right here.
Well, we've used kind of social networks a lot because I suppose with the very limited resources we have, we depend on the goodwill of people to kind of share the links and to tell other people about it. And word of mouth has actually been probably our greatest asset. We have a website, it's thepipetofilm.com, and that's attached to a Facebook page and Twitter. And it's a great way of getting in touch with people and sharing the trailers and the videos and the updates and the screenings, Like, for example, with here, there was a Facebook page for this event, and we could share it with people, and they could, show if they're attending and make comments. So that's been really important, and we're really trying to expand on that, But definitely, it's the kind of film it's kind of people power film. More than just a film, it's such an incredibly important story at home because, it's just a tiny microcosm of what went wrong during the Celtic Tiger. That, the resources of the state and the laws of the state had been put at the behest of all these private interests, be it an oil company, be it a developer, be it the bankers, you name it. And, the normal person in the street, they're the people who are suffering now the consequences of this by a complete lack of political leadership, a complete lack of regulation. And one thing that surprised us is that, it's not just an Irish story. Over here, across the world, it's the same the world over. It really is a global story of how often, politics can conspire with very powerful private interests, to work against the good of of the citizen. I think the media have done such incredible damage to this story that nobody wants to touch it. And it's a very isolated area, and politicians don't see a vote in it. And the media aren't bringing the politicians or the oil companies to task over this. There's been very poor quality of investigative journalism into this. And the one or two journalists who have, like Lorna Siggins in the Irish Times or local journalist Leamy McNally, you know, their careers have been leaned on heavily because of trying to cover Cara honestly.
Question back there.
The European Union thing came out of the fact that people got not even a hearing, you know, in Ireland. So the next step was, let's appeal to Europe. And they got a great hearing in Europe. Now, Europe acts very slowly. And Europe will only interfere if the damage is done. They'll only kind of act retrospectively. However, when it came to the pipeline route which goes through the commonage, what Europe did was that they threatened to injunct, kind of informally, that if you do push this through, and we will injunct. So that did feed into the decision by the planning board to deem the route through Rossport unacceptable. And at the moment, as Rachel said, the Antashka judicial review against the pipeline decision, they're taking it on the basis that it's illegal under European law. Because this bay is, if you try to find an area in Ireland, even Western Europe, with such a high concentration of, you know, specially protected areas under European law, you couldn't. It's just such a vast concentration of sensitive habitats when it comes to migrating geese from Greenland, Brent geese, salmon, you know, sand dune kind of complexes which are very delicate. The bay is protected for whale and dolphin. And the problem has been that when Shell have interfered with this, the regulators have turned a blind eye. So this is why the people are really hoping that they'll get some justification from the European angle. But it remains to be seen. And, you know, people down there have very limited resources. And trying to bring on, you know, pay solicitors and go through court cases when, you know, when Shell and the government control unlimited amount of legal expertise at this is incredibly different. So they need all the help they can get. And at the moment, legally is where they need that help.
And just actually on that, Ireland is the only country in Europe that hasn't yet ratified the Aarhus Convention, which is basically facilitates citizens if they're taking an environmental case against the state. So in other countries, if anything like this was going on, you know, like in Belgium or anywhere else, they'd be able to take a case against the state and not have to worry about matching, you know, euro for euro with giant corporation. Whereas that has, I suppose kind of it's indicative of Ireland as sort of not really taking on board a lot of the decisions that Europe makes, because we're sort of on the peripheries, and therefore, you know, the people that are down in Rossport, as Richie said, have very limited resources, and, you know, the Aarhus Convention hasn't been ratified, so they're literally just trying to pay for things themselves.
Oh, I want to ask a devil's advocate question. A gentleman mentioned the film Gasland. We've shown film here recently called On Coal River that kind of point to the problems of energy sources and reasonable ways of finding energy sources. All of us depend on energy sources. You know, nuclear is not looking too cool right now. So, you know, as a society, we do need energy. And I wonder if, you know, in the case of this pipe, for instance, is there a better way to do it, or is, you know, would the activists against it be totally against it? Or, you know, how do we keep our lights on if we don't find some ways to get energy?
Well, the vast majority of the local people, they were never against the gas. It was never about gas or no gas. They always, you know, they are always quite open that, you know, we live in the 21st century. We use fossil fuels, but there was a better alternative to bring this gas ashore. Either do it at sea or do it in a remote location. But because the oil companies sat down with the politicians behind closed doors and they put this plan together, there was no consultation, you know, meaningful consultation with the local people. Again, the vast majority of the local people were open for a resolution to bring this gas in a way which is in a more sustainable manner. And they always engaged with the process of the state. They always engaged with the planning process, with the courts. I mean, they've had a lot of successes through the planning process. The refinery was originally turned down because the planning inspector said exactly the same thing. You know, it's in the wrong place. There are better alternatives. However, Shell met with her Taoiseach Bertie Ahern behind closed doors. Pressure was put on the planning board, and the refinery was given permission. And there's a whole catalogue of interference with the planning process. So there have always been alternatives on the table, but because it's been more expedient and cheaper for the oil companies who have the go-ahead, the green light from the government, they haven't been forced to consider alternatives.
I think, sorry, just to kind of put it in context as well, just when, so you have an idea of the pipeline, when Willie is walking down the field and talking about a 345 bar pipe, that amount of pressure kind of meant nothing to me for a while, but the pressure in your car tyre is 2 bar, and that gas will have no smell as well. So, I mean, obviously nobody builds a pipeline with the intention for it to fail, but when it's so close to people's homes and when it's at that amount of pressure and when there's no smell, when it's untreated gas coming straight out of the ground, the potential, if anything was to go wrong, that is the concern. The concern of the community has always been kind of health and safety. And, you know, they're driving their tractors, they're driving their boats, they're using fuel. They're not against progress, they're not against development, but just that it's done in a sustainable way.
The question was, is there any plans to boycott Shell in the United States?
Well, I mean, one thing I've tried to do is I've tried not to be an activist, and I've tried to step back and observe this as honestly as I can, and not to try and slant it in any way. It's not up to me to call for people to boycott or to take any kind of action. You know, my main thing is to show the story, let people make up their own mind. And, you know, there are campaign groups and there are the local people. And, you know, it's up to people to get in touch with them directly. Greenpeace don't operate in Ireland. And there have been kind of environmental groups who have come and gone, but it's gone on for so long and it's so complex that it often comes back down to the local people themselves, you know, to stand up for themselves. And they're the people who are always there. If you get in contact with us too, either through Shell2C or through us, thepipetofilm.com, and we've an email on it. It's thepipetofilm@gmail.com. You know, we can put people in touch with people locally. And you know what people need, you know, people down there, they really appreciate even a phone call or a letter of support. And if there are people also who know how to support people in terms of legal support or anything like that, it's very much welcomed.
Thank you very much for coming, and thanks especially to Richie and Rachel.